I love crabs. I grew up eating crabs out of my backyard on the water, right? But you were not allowed to eat them as ancient Israelites. And why? Because crabs are duplicitous, seemingly, in their symbolism or signification. They can't decide whether they should live in the water or they should live on the land. And they kind of, crawl side to side with their claws up, pinching. There's something duplicitous about the way they live. They're two-faced, you could say. They live in two realms. You can think of Jesus' teaching that you cannot serve both God and money. You can't serve both God and mammon. It's all or nothing. You either are for God or you're against God. You have to choose life or choose death. Greetings, friends. It's great to be with you again. Today is the feast of St. Augustine of Hippo, a father and doctor of the Church. Born in 354, he died in the year 430. And it's even been said of Augustine that all of subsequent Western Christian theology is a footnote to Augustine. Now, with that being said, it doesn't seem like we can really do justice to him in one YouTube video, no matter how long that video proves to be, because the fact is that Augustine has left us 5.4 million of his own words, which is vastly more than any other ancient author. And they happen in numerous sorts of works. In his early life, he gave us philosophical treatises in the dialogue form. We have the massive City of God, which is a giant history of the Bible and an engagement with pagan thought. You have hundreds and hundreds of sermons on the Scripture. We have hundreds and hundreds of letters. But perhaps the most endearing of all of his works, and the work we'll draw from today in our meditations upon this great saint on his feast, is from his Confessions. And really, there's a lot of things we could say about the Confessions, but I really just want to focus on one aspect in kind of three stages. And that is that Augustine thinks there are great lessons that can be derived by simply looking at the process of human ages. That in the stages of human life, we are presented with something like a lesson about humanity and the spiritual life. And I think one of the things that Augustine gives us that's so brilliant isn't just an insight into God's works, but specifically God's works through the human person. So what are the three stages that maybe we can look at today? I'd say they are infancy, adolescence, and the time of our death. Infancy, adolescence, and the time of our death. And in each of those cases, we're going to kind of, you could say, pull out some little nuggets from Augustine for us to understand and deepen our appreciation of those stages. So first is infancy. I think through looking at infancy, we're going to be able to understand Augustine's views on language and memory insofar as they relate to self-knowledge and knowledge of God. Second, we can look at adolescence. Adolescence gives us great insight into sin and the disintegrating effects of sin. And finally, at the moment of our death, we have an insight into baptism, friendship, the church, and indeed silence. So first, infancy. Augustine begins his Confessions in Book 1, kind of, this is in the case kind of like chapter 1, but they're called books, like the books of the Bible. In Book 1, Augustine begins his Confessions with a treatment of his own infancy. But understandably, his infancy lies outside of his memory, just like your infancy and my infancy is outside of our memories. It's one of the strange features of our experience as humans aging that we all have a kind of collective amnesia about what it is to be an infant. And what we see from our studies is the reason that infancy is relegated to a collective amnesia is because we do not yet have language. That is that until we develop words, and not just the words that my toddler daughter is able to articulate with ball and milk and toast and all her favorite words, right, is that you actually be able to structure them in sentences to narrate or tell stories about what is going on in your life. It's the ability to tell a story that ultimately is what allows us to remember something. And so those first really 2-3 years of our life, until we're able to structure real stories that we can recite in a way that's powerful, those are forgotten. But there's also a powerful spiritual insight Augustine sees there, that we enter the world with a kind of fundamental frustration. And this is very quickly seen by anyone who's taken care of a newborn. Immediately, the newborn has been thrust out of the most perfect place they could have ever lived, their mother's womb, with food and climate control and a perpetual, spa treatment. And now they're out in the world that is cold and scary and bright and noisy. And they have to figure out how to find their food for themselves, it seems. And so what does a newborn baby do incessantly? Cry. It's the only way they know. They don't have yet words. But the problem, as anyone who has been with a newborn knows, is that this crying is actually pretty difficult to discern the cause of. Are they hungry? Do they just want some attention? Do they want to be held? Do they need to be burped? Are they sleepy? Are they hot? Are they cold? Are they just crying because they're frustrated at the reality of being a human being? Right? We don't know. And so you have this kind of fundamental inaccessibility. And so there's this mutual, you could say, interpersonal human frustration that the infant feels with the inability to express themselves, and the parents feel with the inability to understand the infant. And so what Augustine describes then is that the child, and he can think of himself in this own way, that the child begins to desperately cling and grasp for words. Is that when you watch a toddler acquiring language, the sheer delight they feel when their words are communicating their needs or their feelings, or even just their ability to begin to pretend and tell a kind of rudimentary story, or the first time you hear your kid tell a joke, no matter how badly formulated it is, you see a kind of magical delight in their eyes. That they are, as Augustine says, precious, finely wrought vessels, that is, words. And the words allow us to build stories, to make sense of what's going on. And I'd say this is really important in the Christian life because, as the opening of the Gospel of John reveals to us, the second person of the Most Holy Trinity, one of his names is the Word of God. And that God, in a particular way, this is so special here at the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, he chooses to reveal himself through human words in the Scriptures, and the words that he entrusted to the prophets, and the words that his incarnate Son spoke here on earth, in his parables and his proclamation of the gospel, in his interactions with his disciples, and the answers he gave to his opponents. We see words entrusted to us, and that these words then are an attempt through narrative to capture the movements of human hearts. But we still have that kind of mystery. The other thing we could maybe think of here, and it's a funny image that maybe we could take from infancy, is if you spend time with infants, infants spit up their food. They don't do a great job digesting it, right? And you think, okay, that's a strange thing to try to derive some kind of spiritual lesson from. But actually, there's a connection, I'd say, to some of what we are given in the Scriptures. If we pay attention to the Mosaic Law, you'll notice that we're allowed to eat certain animals and you're not allowed to eat other animals. And it's not that the animals are unclean, because as the Scripture tells us, God made all things good in creation. So the animals themselves are not somehow problematic. But there's a kind of signification, a kind of symbolism that the animals are able to capture. So for instance, you can't eat shellfish. Well, why can't you eat a shellfish? Crabs, if we just think of crabs here in this case. I love crabs. I grew up eating crabs out of my backyard on the water, right? But you were not allowed to eat them as ancient Israelites. And why? Because crabs are duplicitous, seemingly, in their symbolism or signification. They can't decide whether they should live in the water or they should live on the land. And they kind of, crawl side to side with their claws up, pinching. There's something duplicitous about the way they live. They're two-faced, you could say. They live in two realms. You can think of Jesus' teaching that you cannot serve both God and money. You can't serve both God and mammon. It's all or nothing. You either are for God or you're against God. You have to choose life or choose death. Where you think of that whole biblical teaching of two ways that is so predominant in the Scriptures, you have that captured simply in the crab, who's kind of sitting on the fence, unable to decide. So don't eat crabs. But this is not necessarily the lesson of the crab, that is most relevant to what we're talking about when we talk about infancy. Instead, what we're interested in is the animals we are allowed to eat. Most of the animals you're allowed to eat in the Bible, that is mammals at least, if we're talking about mammals, because you could eat various birds, had to be ruminants. And so what are we talking about when we talk about ruminants? So ruminants are herbivores, plant eaters, who eat their food, but then because they have a bad digestive tract and they're eating almost exclusively difficult to digest grains, they regurgitate it and they chew it again in their mouth, calling chewing the cud. You've probably seen animals do this. So think of cattle, goats, sheep, deer, but also this would include bison, buffalo, antelope, gazelle, and even giraffes. Now we have no evidence of the ancient Israelite people eating giraffes, but they would have been permitted seemingly. But why were you allowed to eat ruminants? Why is that a good symbol? Right? You think of the infant coughing back up its food. Because we are, and this is even what the Proverbs say in Proverbs 21:20, a desirable treasure finds rest in the mouth of the wise man, but a fool swallows it. That the things of the Lord need to be chewed on more. You don't just swallow them once and move past them. That once you put them in your mouth, you want to treasure them, enjoy them in your mouth. So maybe some meditations from infancy there. Let's move to adolescence, this next stage. Well, what in particular about adolescent puberty could be a spiritual lesson? Well, if we understand adolescence, it's a time of fundamental tension for all of us, really, as we develop into this stage. But why so? It's a time of tension because what we are having happening within us as human beings is that we are achieving physical maturity while we are still quite far from psychological or spiritual maturity. So you have developed the physical ability to reproduce, but you are far from capable at a human level, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, of actually fathering or mothering a child that you could actually create physically. And this, Augustine sees in itself, is a sign of the disintegration that comes about by sin. So what do I mean by disintegration? When our first parents, Adam and Eve, were created in Eden, they were created with a gift called integrity. This basically means their human nature worked the way it was supposed to. Their intellect, their reason, was in charge of their will, their decision-making, their choices. And the intellect and the will together were in charge of their emotions or passions. And the human soul was in charge of the body. But we see all the time in our human experience, I know I certainly feel it in my own human experience, the extent to which when you're getting up in the morning, your body seems to dominate your soul. Or that our intellect is put at the service of our emotions, on our will to rationalize things that we maybe know we shouldn't do, but we want to justify. And so we feel this experience of disintegration, being pulled apart within ourselves. And we find ourselves kind of throwing ourselves upon other things, seeking rest in things that can't give us rest because only God can give us rest. We experience disintegration. Maybe the other thing that Augustine points us to, that is a feature maybe in particular of adolescence, is lustful infatuation. And what we see in this is that Augustine simply says that he was in love with loving and being loved. And what that means is it's not actually about the person whom he loves, but instead about the act of loving itself. That a young person can feel powerfully infatuated about a person who they know almost nothing about, but they want to feel in love. Or a young person can know that, a young person finds out so-and-so likes me, and they suddenly decide when there was no previous reciprocal emotions that they are going to respond with emotions in return because it feels good to be wanted. But it doesn't have the selflessness, the willing the good of the other, the sacrifice that characterizes true human love. It's also in itself disintegrating. Anything that's lustful has a way of pulling apart body and soul. Any of the sins of lust are in themselves separating the human person's soul from the human person's body when we make them an object of desire. And so adolescence is a powerful image of the struggle against sin. Maybe one last thing we can say about adolescence. We have adolescence as disintegration, adolescence as infatuation. Also, adolescence, as relates to sin, can often involve what Augustine calls a gang mentality. Augustine spends a lot of time in his Confessions talking about pear theft. It's a strange sin, it seems like, to spend so much time on. But he's saying, why did I steal these pears? I wasn't hungry, they weren't ripe, I stole a whole lot of them and I threw them to some swine. He comes up with two reasons. One, he did it because he wanted to feel free and powerful and able to do it on his own. But second was because he said he loved the camaraderie. He loved the gang mentality. He knows that he would have only done it in this group context. And so there's something about adolescence that seeks belonging to such an extent that it sometimes brings us into sin. Let us then look at the third and final of these age moments, you could say these stages of human life that Augustine wants to turn to, and that's death. A moment that we can focus on here in conclusion. There's several elements we can look at in death, but maybe the one I'm most interested in is how Augustine thinks about death in relationship to friendship. Early in the Confessions, when Augustine is basically a teenager, one of his dear friends, who he doesn't name, dies. And it's an amazingly traumatic event for Augustine. He describes himself as walking about the streets of the city, unable to be consoled, that the only thing he could find any kind of rest in was his weeping and his mourning. You can almost get the sense of him clinging to the weeping and mourning, not knowing what else he can do. But there was something closed in about the friendship, something about the friendship that was consuming, that was maybe not how we imagine friendship ought to be in the Christian life. At the end of the autobiographical portion of the Confessions, Augustine spends a lengthy period of time talking about the death of his mother, Monica, who he loves dearly, who prayed him back into the Catholic Church, who loved him so much. And we get a very different sequence when we describe Monica's death. Augustine has been baptized with his son Adeodatus and his dear friend Alypius, and with Monica they're getting ready to return to North Africa, where Augustine was born and raised. And they're there on a beach little hamlet known as Ostia, which is basically west of Rome on the coast, to go on the sea. And Monica says, Augustine, I don't care where you bury me. I have the only thing I wished for, which was seeing you a Catholic Christian. And Augustine's like, Mom, don't talk about dying. This is kind of a depressing conversation topic. Let's just go back to Africa. She says, you don't need to worry about burying me next to your father. And she does ultimately end up dying, but before she dies, Augustine and Monica, in what is true Christian friendship, it's not closed in on themselves, that true Christian friends are turned outward. We can think of this kind of romantic vision if we have of an elderly couple of two people sitting next to each other in rocking chairs, looking out at their property before them. It's not kind of closed in on each other. If you think of, I know growing up, one of the things that I loved doing most with my family were going on hikes, and you're just walking next to each other. You're not looking at each other, you're looking ahead at the path, at your final destination. There's something in Monica and Augustine that they're looking forward towards their final destination. And they have this encounter with God. And I'll read part of what Augustine says. They're having a conversation, and while they're having this conversation, they experience God in a powerful way. And it's interesting to notice how they experience God. If the tumult of the flesh fell silent for someone, and silent too were the phantasms of earth and sea and air, and silent the heavens, and the very soul silent to itself, it might pass beyond itself by not thinking of its own being. If dreams and revelations known through its imagination were silent, if every tongue and every sign and whatever is subject to transience were wholly stilled for him, if anyone listens, all these things will tell him, we did not make ourselves. He made us who abides forever. And having said this, they held their peace. And then he were alone to speak, and through things that are made but of himself, that we might hear his word. A beautiful description, and I even shortened it. It's this huge, beautiful, lengthy description Augustine has of he and his mother together experiencing wisdom, the Word, Jesus Christ in eternity. But what is the key word that comes out over and over and over and over again in Augustine's description of this hearing of God at Ostia? It's the word silence. That it's when all the things of creation are silenced. They say, we didn't make ourselves, God made us. Look at the Creator. When all those things are silenced, when the things of our mind are silenced, our dreams and our revelations, our imaginations, we make our very soul silent, our mind and the words, when all of this is silenced, then God, the Word, Jesus, can speak to us in a way that is unmediated, in a kind of directness, in a way that ravishes us and leaves us aching for more. And what is a feature of death universally? A feature of death is silence. We enter into this great and challenging silence at the end of our life. But maybe that is something that we can invite ourselves into. We are baptized into Christ's death, but perhaps we have to enter into more deeply into the silence to hear Jesus. And this idea of silence connects to the most famous quote of all, the quote that if anyone knows a quote of St. Augustine, they know this one. And there are many quotes attributed to Augustine, many that are true and many that are not. But this quote people know well. You stir us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have made us and drawn us to yourself. And our heart is unquiet until it rests in you. Now, this version I just read of that quote may sound different than the one with which you're familiar. That's by Sister Maria Boulding, a late Benedictine sister from Britain who has passed away. May she rest in peace. The more familiar rendering of that is something like Frank Sheed, who ends with, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. Now, Sheed's quote is beautiful. It's archaic English. It has a kind of majesty, and you get this parallel between restless, the heart is restless until it rests in thee. Now, I don't want to be a Latinist or a grumpy scholar, but I just want to point out two small differences in the translations of Sheed and Boulding that I think are actually illuminating. One thing is Sheed says our hearts in the plural are restless, while the Latin is cor, C-O-R. It's in the singular. It's our heart. This is something that is collective, that whether it's in the infant stage or the adolescent stage or here at the moment of death, there is something common about the human experience. And when I talk about these stages, don't think of them as like the infant stage only applies when you're actually an infant. There are ways that we are still spiritually infantile. There's still ways that we are spiritually adolescent, but there's also ways that we can be spiritually mature and preparing ourselves for death in silence. But this is a universal human experience. The last thing I'll note here is that maybe the most strikingly different word is that Sister Maria Boulding says, our heart is unquiet. It's inquietum in the Latin. It is unquiet until it rests in you. Another way you can maybe think of this is, it's literally our heart is noisy. There's the noise of all the media we take and all the things we read online and in print. There's the voices and opinions of others. We can just be sitting at Mass or driving in the car and we can feel so many other voices and so many other opinions. It's very hard to have self-knowledge, and even more, it's very hard to hear God when there's so much noisiness. So it's unsurprising then that the unquiet heart, the noisy and restless human heart of Monica and Augustine hears God in silence. So perhaps then on this day, this holy feast of St. Augustine, Doctor of Grace and Father of the Church, we can just focus on these lessons. That from infancy we can learn that we are mysterious creatures to ourselves and to others, and that words are prized possessions to try to describe the narrative of our own heart. And that we need to chew. We need to regurgitate the things of the Lord, that they're not things that we should only experience once, but that we need to treasure them and bring them up again and again to think of the Lord's works in our life over and over. That ultimately we experience the disintegration of sin, that we look for other things to love simply to love them, but that only God can be a source of love. That we should seek true community and true friendship, not for its own sake, but for the sake of pursuing the good, pursuing a final destination. And ultimately, we must prepare ourselves in silence to find the quiet that cuts off all the noise of ourself and the noise of others, because it's there where we truly can hear the Jesus who wants to speak to us and wants to bring rest to our heart. Thank you so much. Have a blessed feast. This has been Dr. Shane Owens with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology.